my plan for today is to present in some detail one study, and then in almost no detail a lot of other studies, all of which are concerned with multiple representations of one form or another. And what I like about this work is that I really started by reading the basic research, which was mostly coming out of Europe. It was mostly done with undergraduate non-science students, mostly looking at science text and diagrams or animations. And kind of occurred to me like, well, maybe we could teach these skills to kids in real classrooms. So I started by reading the basic research. I then did some applied research, but I have now come back to doing a bunch of basic research, and then some applied research, and now some more basic research, which I think is a little bit unusual in, at least in educational psychology. People tend to be either doing the basic research or doing the applied research. But I would encourage you to explore how much fun it is to go back and forth, because it's really interesting and exciting, I think, to see, when you're working with students in classrooms and you're trying to help them learn to do something new, what do you start learning about the nature of the phenomenon? And then when you go dig deeper into it, what ideas does that give you about going back into the classroom and trying to figure out better ways to instruct. Just briefly, there's been some work that analyzes representations in science textbooks, and there tends to be about one per page. That's pretty steady across middle school, high school, and undergraduate textbooks. Of course, as you all know, middle school textbooks are thin. High school textbooks are, they're about half an inch. High school textbooks are about an inch, and undergraduate textbooks are about 3 inches. Surprisingly to teachers, and surprisingly to many of our colleagues as we explain this work, students actually don't do very well at making sense out of these visual representations. That's true whether you're engineering researchers like Usaka and Manala, or whether you're in middle school classrooms, or even whether you're looking at standardized tests. So there are some theories of multimodal comprehension that actually underlie some of the tests, like the PISA test item development is actually based on a particular theory. But in general, when kids have visual representations in test items, they tend to score lower on those. And there are various kinds of manipulations, most of them manipulations of the stimulus itself, that can help folks better understand things like text and diagrams, animations, simulations. So we can tweak the way that the diagram looks, or we can tweak the way that we connect the text on the diagram. And if you think about some professional communities of practice, some of the early work was done by Bob Kozma. He went into chemistry laboratories, and he saw that those professional chemists, they were making sketches, they were looking at formulae, they were looking at nuclear magnetic resonance output, they were looking at these representations, and almost everything that they did was just going back and forth between one type of representation and another. And so there has been this sort of big idea that you have these communities of practice, they have these representations that are canonical representations for whatever that practice is, whether it's, being a painter, or being a chemist, or being a historian, a geographer, whatever it is, you have representations that are sort of the canonical representations. And you can fluently and very quickly translate between. Now, mathematicians don't like that word because translation actually has a very specific meaning in mathematics. But you can translate between and among these representations, and essentially that is part of the expertise. So if you're an expert radiologist, you look at an X-ray and you can very quickly see what the normal and abnormal parts of that X-ray are, and that is really part of being an expert in that discipline. So there was a very important paper by Sharon Ainsworth published in 2006, which she has never called a theory, but it essentially has served as a theory. And she sort of urged the folks to go beyond this question whether multiple representations work. In other words, is there a multimedia effect? Yeah, okay, illustrations help people. But let's go beyond that and try to think about when and for whom do those representations work. And one of the things that we know, again, from some of this earlier work, again with European undergraduates, is that we can provide certain types of scaffolding. And so this Bottomer and Faust paper tries various ways of linking what's in the text to what's in the diagram. If any of you are familiar with this is the Varmapumpa paper. So it's a heating, I'm blanking on the name of this in English because it has such a funny name in German. But it's the, it heats your house and it sits outside and it captures whatever heat energy there is in the outside air even when it's cold. Anyway, you guys, somebody will remember.
It's a heat pump.
Heat pump, yes. So Varmapumpe in German.
That's what you said in the first place.
Yes, Varmapumpe. So just starting from these sort of big ideas of when and for whom do these non-textual representations work and scaffolding can help. Of course, being an educational psychologist, I wanted to go to theory, and there are quite a few theories out there, but I want to talk through a little bit Hagerty's theory because I think it's the one that will resonate most with those of you who sort of think from a psychological basis. And the other feature of Hagerty's theory that makes it different from something like cognitive load theory or Mayer's theory of multimedia learning or even Schnatz's theory, which I think resonates a lot with those of us who are reading researchers. But what Hagerty's theory builds on is research on diagrams that are simultaneously more complex and more realistic. So if you think about the Mayer theory, he has 90-second animations with kind of cartoony, and I like Rich, and he's on the advisory board for my multimedia meta-analysis project, but he's got a cartoony cloud with some positive and negative charges in it, and a little lightning bolt comes down, and it's neither particularly complex nor particularly realistic. Whereas Hagerty's work really builds on some other work that says, well, our representations ought to be more complex and more realistic, and there may be other things to discover that we can't figure out from extremely simplified, extremely stylized diagrams. So the other thing that I think resonates with me in terms of Hagerty's theory is that like something like a construction integration model, it includes both top-down and bottom-up processes, and I'll unpack a little bit what I mean by that. So Hagerty talks about how your eyes go on this diagram, and there's some basic perceptual processes and some basic attention. Where on the diagram are your eyes landing? But you're going to try to find relevant regions of the display, but then immediately your knowledge about whatever that topic is, whether it's knowing about the lightning bolt or knowing about the Varmapumpa or whatever it is, that your knowledge immediately starts shaping what you pay attention to and what you get from that display. So immediately you might be thinking, oh, wait a minute, a picture is not worth 1,000 words. A picture is worth a certain number of words that depends on how much you know about that subject already. But then your bottom-up processes start kicking in again, and it's sort of presented in a sequential way. I don't think that she intends it to be this very mechanistic top-down, bottom-up, top-down, bottom-up. But so you are then encoding some relevant information from the display. But your judgments of relevance, again, the top-down processes start to play a role because your topic knowledge and whatever learning task we've given you, right, start to dictate what's relevant. So if the learning task is just to find a particular fact or to describe a trend, let's say, in a graph, That's a very different task from, I want you to create your own representation of X or Y or Z, or I want you to teach this to somebody else, or I want you to write an explanation of why this happens when that happens. And then in a very Kinchian sort of way, she talks about how that activation of your topic knowledge is then going to activate other related things in your memory, right? So our information tends to be quite heavily interconnected in our memory. So there's this idea of spreading activation. And then she talks about something that almost nobody in any of the other theories talk about, which is you may have to draw some inferences, right? There may be syllogistic reasoning, deductive reasoning that you engage in. And she talks about that as sort of part of the encoding step. And then you're trying to make sense out of what you now have. She describes it as an internal mental image, but that very much, again, like the Kinch construction integration theory, you're trying to actually link, it's not just that the prior knowledge happens to have some effect on, for example, what you're noticing, is that you are deliberately trying to integrate this new information with what you have in memory. Okay, and then the end product is some sort of a coherent mental model. So I think inference, first of all, the top-down, bottom-up is really important, and the role of prior knowledge. And second, that, again, if you look at a lot of, let's say, the cognitive load theory work, even though transfer may be measured as a dependent variable, or some sort of inference measure may be given at post-test, there's no mention of any inferential processes during learning. Whereas Hagerty's model I have found really useful because the kinds of representations that I'm looking at, and I've done this mostly with high school and undergraduate biology students, is that there's a lot of inference that has to go on. So one of the things that I've found in my work, and this is from the 2010 paper, which has been cited pretty well right now. This was from an actual undergraduate biology textbook. It's related to the immune system. And immune system actually is often not taught at the high school level, even though this textbook is the most frequently used AP, Advanced Placement Biology textbook. But just to quickly break this down, our immune system cells in our body need to be able to detect when there are invaders there. And sometimes we have cells of our body that have been invaded by a bacterium. So the bacterium or the virus has actually come into the cell. We have other cells in our body that kind of go around and eat up the bacteria. They're usually called phagocytes. Is a particular kind called a macrophage, and it has gobbled up some sort of bacterium. And it's hard to see, probably from where you're sitting, but there are these large molecules inside our cells whose job is to go in and pick up those fragments and bring them to the surface of the cell so that these body cells, helper T cells are the ones that get destroyed in HIV/AIDS, and cytotoxic T cells are actually like, I am going to kill you, you are infected. That's the toxic part of cytotoxic. But these two molecules are very slightly different. The ones that bring that fragment to the surface and sort of send out this signal like wah, wah, infection, infection. So there's this really intense compare and contrast thing that has to happen with a lot of these diagrams. And you could think of this as involving a lot of sort of, there is a lot of deductive logic that has to happen here, right? Because you have to recognize that this cell here and this cell here are actually different kinds of cells. They're doing different things in our bodies. And yet there's this common thing of this large molecule, which is called an MHC molecule. When there's an MHC type 1 and an MHC type 2, they both bring these fragments to the surface, and then they both get recognized by T cells, but this one is the helper T cell, and this one is the cytotoxic T cell. So we were able to show something that Ainsworth had hypothesized, which is that when people are in texty part, so the running text that accompanies this, versus when they're in the diagrams, they're actually engaging with different strategies. They're actually doing different things cognitively. And then the second thing is something that Ainsworth found in one of her earlier studies, that people are not just doing this kind of comparing and contrasting inferences, but also drawing conclusions about what's important and what's most important in sort of what's the big idea that's going on here. In addition, and so again, this inference thing is not there in the other theories, but it is there in Hagerty's theory. Reasoning about why certain functions can or cannot occur based on structure, which is certainly true in biology, right? We talk about structure and function, that the structures are the way they are because they function in certain ways. And I believe in chemistry that that is present as well. And then also, inferences allow you to make predictions. So a certain class of inference would be a prediction about how a system would perform under certain conditions. And this is a pretty well-cited paper from Art Gracer and Gracer and Oldie, where they had a lock and a key, and they said if a certain part was, if the key turned but it didn't make the lock open, what might have gone wrong? So this idea of sort of tracing the causal path through a set of steps and being able to make predictions about, for example, what was broken or why it might not be working. So drawing on this basis in theory, we designed some intervention work with high school classes, and we worked in 2 different high schools, and so I'm going to give you more detail about the first one and then less detail about the second one, and then I'm going to start getting into like almost no detail. But there were 12 classes randomly assigned within teachers, quasi-experiment with intact classes, and those of you who know your stats are thinking non-independence of observations. Turns out our ICCs on these diagram comprehension measures were very low, like 0.02, which is really, for those of you who do classroom research, you're like, no, that can't be right. It must have been 0.22. But it turns out that like some spatial skills, we don't have this very tight going togetherness of, like reading scores have super high ICCs, math scores have super high ICCs, science tests tend to have super high ICCs. Whatever we're doing, tracking kids into classes, we're not tracking them on spatial, and we're not tracking them on diagram comprehension either. So 99 high school biology students. It was a 9th grade class. There were some retained 10th graders who were in the classes. It was a big but relatively low achieving public high school. Kids were just average age for 9th grade, about half female, about 65% white. But it was quite low SES. So for 79% of the kids, neither parent had graduated from college. So I thought you all would probably be pretty interested in our measures. We have a biology diagram comprehension measure, and we think of it as a near transfer measure in that none of the representations were ones that they actually studied in the intervention. And it's a little hard to see, but as shown by the colors below, the pattern of limb bones in an early amphibian bears a distinct resemblance to the pattern of fin bones in a lobe-finned fish. What is the color in figure 11 intended to show? So we taught students in the interventions various ways to better understand the diagrams, one of which was, here's color coding, here's what it means, here are arrows, here's what they mean, surprisingly large number of things that arrows mean. And Ting Dai, Dr. Dai, actually worked on this project as a graduate student. We also taught them about captions, labeling, symbols like delta for change. I have all of the workbooks are actually available through the UIUC Ideals repository. So if you, I should have put the link up here, but if you want to see what the actual intervention materials look like, you can see them. We also had a biology knowledge measure just to make sure that the diagram stuff wasn't only about knowledge. And then we're thinking about sort of, if that was a near transfer measure, then could we show any far transfer? And Nora Newcomb was part of this project, and she was really interested in geology as a transfer domain. So we had a geology knowledge and a geology diagram comprehension measure. We were interested in the role of spatial skills, and so we gave the mental rotations test. It's very well known. 3D figures are rotated in space on various axes. I know you guys in chemistry have used this a lot. And then while the students were completing our intervention, they wrote their answers in paper colored photocopied workbooks, and we coded the student responses to those exercises. And I think you'll see that's a theme in all of this, almost all of this research that I do, where, okay, I'm interested in the pretest, and I'm interested in the post-test, and I'm interested in differential change from pretest to post-test. We're really interested in what they're doing while they're learning. So we basically built this around what they were covering in their textbook. We scanned almost all the images from the textbook, created the exercises, and the two different conditions that we put them in were this conventions of diagrams, which we embedded in there as what we call diagram decoding tips, and then questions for the students to answer. So we said, you know, tip. Look at the arrows and try to figure out whether they're showing change over time or one thing influencing another thing, et cetera, et cetera. And then we would give them a scanned image from their own textbook that had something like an arrow in it, and we would say, tell us, you know, explain what this arrow is doing. The one that we call CMR is for coordinating multiple representations, was coming out of some of this previous literature saying, okay, people are reading along, they get to that figure reference that says see figure 42.7, that you should then cast your eyes over there. So we had them just practice with a pen in the workbook, actually drawing an arrow from where it says see figure 42.7 over to figure 42.7. And then if there was any spatial language, this is on top of this, or this pushes that. When you're reading about a part but you don't know what it does, or anything that was bolded, because we figure, you know, the textbooks kind of have this convention that they bold some important term, and you ought to go look at the diagram and look up that bolded term. So they drew arrows, they circled different parts, and they wrote in some answers. And the reason why I mentioned this is that we coded all of these things that they did in order to understand what were they engaging in while they were doing the learning. We provided a couple hours of professional development. We asked the teachers to just imagine that you're a student, work through the questions in the workbook. We did some modeling of things like defining a vocabulary term or providing a hint. And we created this kind of teacher edition of the two workbooks, which had ideas for scaffolding. We showed them the instructional fidelity checklist that we used. And we also asked them simultaneously to be giving us feedback on things that we could improve in the workbooks. Okay, parent guardian consent, student assent, pretests, classes assigned to treatments. So the teachers kind of did their usual teaching. They might have had a PowerPoint or some end of chapter questions or something like that. But then when they got to the point where there was a diagram in the textbook, we would ask them kind of stop the action and complete the one exercise, and that might be 5 minutes. And then they would kind of go back into their regular teaching, and at some point they'd get to another. I spent a lot of time in these classrooms waiting for them to get to the workbook page. And then they would do a little bit of discussion, right? What did you guys find? What did you guys find? What was your answer? So we estimated that it was about 260 minutes of intervention over 18 class periods, post-tests afterwards. As I mentioned, ICCs were very low. We looked at the pretest, and scores were the same on the diagram reasoning and the biology knowledge. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of looking at the learning process and coding for what they were doing while they were learning. So we first of all just coded whether they tried to answer that question at all, which in some ways is a proxy for they were in class, right? Because if they were in class, they usually tried to put something in there. And then for their level of inference in the answer, but taking into account what the question, what level of inference that question was demanding. So if we asked them a very literal question, we weren't going to, ding them because they didn't make an inference. But when the question did ask for an inference, we wanted to, give them more credit. We did do double coding, and we had 100% was double coded, and we had a very high level of agreement. So on the post-test scores, significantly higher for the CMR condition on biology knowledge and on biology diagrams, and you can see the Cohen's d effect sizes are pretty good, 0.44 for knowledge and 0.41 for diagrams. We were not able to show, we think of this as a FAR transfer, so we're not able to show FAR transfer in this study, but there was significant growth for both groups, which is kind of interesting. Basically, we did some little regressions to say, well, look, if our condition, if our experiment, or if our treatment is getting you to actually make inferences during learning, then maybe the reason why the treatment is effective is because of those inferences. So basically, if you put in the workbook coding for how much inference they were doing, the effective condition disappears because the condition is effective because it leads them to draw inferences. When you look at the workbook coding, it looks like the CMR, they were scoring higher on this inference coding. In other words, maybe the reason why this coordinating multiple representations is slightly better than the conventions of diagrams is because it's getting them to draw inferences. That didn't apply to the geology diagrams, which may sort of explain. Yeah?
Before you go on, could you go back a second? What are the opportunities to show inference in the COD?
It was all about the questions that we were asking, because sometimes a causal arrow required you to make an inference. Okay, so we then replicated this in another smaller school, and this was the teacher who was our first guinea pig for the conventions of diagrams. I think, Ting, you spent a lot of time with this teacher. Yeah, it was a fascinating school in a large East Coast city. In this case, there were 65 kids in, I want to say, 4 classes. And the pattern and magnitude of the results was really the same. In other words, we have just a very straightforward replication of the findings. And so I think we could say that there's some support for Hagerty's theory that we confirmed it for a near transfer measure, but not for far transfer. And I think there's a real proof of concept, and I don't mean like proving anything, but can you take these principles from cognitive psychology, create an intervention for high school students and help them learn the biology better? Absolutely. Focusing on the diagrams led not only to improvement in diagram scores, which it's nice that they understood the diagrams better, but really what we would like is for them to get the biology better. And this was the thing that was really exciting to us, was that they were actually learning this biology better. And we also think that it's relatively easy to implement, and the teachers were okay at doing what we asked them to do. So that's my long study. And then I just wanted to show you lots of other stuff that I've done. And of course, I would welcome any thoughts about connections between this and other studies. So I wanted to give a little bit of detail about this undergraduate students thinking aloud while reading from their own textbook, because this, to me, continues to be really, really interesting. We treated this data analysis of think aloud protocols as a within subjects design. In other words, what were they saying while they were in the running text, and what were they saying when they were in the diagram? And when they're in the running text, they're using a lot more of these low-level strategies like highlighting and paraphrasing. Low-level in the sense that they're not transforming the information very much. They're really just kind of taking it as it's given to them. But they also used a wider range of, I call them cognitive activities, but for example, when we code for the different types of inferences, they're using a wider range. So it's like they're going to the smorgasbord and they're taking more things, more dishes from the smorgasbord. They also have more just getting to that word like phagocyte and not knowing how to say it, and also expressing more vocabulary difficulty. Antigen presenting cell, I don't understand what that is. But within the diagram, so first of all, a lot of them skip the diagram, right? And we may have this sort of myth about the visual 21st century learner. But in fact, an awful lot of them just just like it wasn't there. But when they do go in there, they make more of these inferences and more of the higher level strategies, summarizing rather than paraphrasing, knowledge elaborations rather than just an inference between a couple of propositions that they were given. They also more often said, I like or don't like diagrams. And there was no significant difference on metacognitive monitoring, either judgments of learning or feeling of knowing. There were no differences on verbalizations of specific background knowledge, specific prior knowledge. So it did seem to us that maybe there's some sort of a trade-off between lower and higher level strategy use, but also that when students skip the diagrams, they're depriving themselves of the opportunity to engage in those inferential processes that are so critical. So the thing that they really need to be doing, they most resist doing, which I think has interesting implications as we move forward and think about taking the work into classrooms, because frankly, when you ask students to do self-explanation, they complain a lot. They don't like to do it. This is another project, a very large-scale center funded by IES, and we did big modifications to 3 existing traditional and 3 reform middle school science curricula. Each of them was done over about a 6-week period, and Ting, I believe you worked on this as well. There was a 3-day professional development workshop for teachers, and we did have 3 arms in the study. There was a control group that got where the teachers got no professional development. There was a teacher professional development that was just focused around content. So if they were learning about weather and water, it was meteorology content. If they were learning about Earth history, which was one of the units, they learned about geology content. And then our cognitive science intervention was relatively complex because it included both the conventions of diagrams work and contrasting cases, a la Schwartz and Bransford, as well as some work on misconceptions. So, but what's cool about this is we were able to test the effects on some assessments that we had created, but also on state high-stakes tests. And this was tens of thousands of students. So for the traditional curriculum, we got effects only on our measures that we had written, our post-tests that we had written. And it was only true when the teachers were teaching the curriculum the second time. And this is a very common finding from RCTs, that teachers really need a whole year of trying it out before they can effectively improve kids' learning. And we also found this interaction with the classes that were highest in underrepresented minority students. And so what's disappointing here is in the schools that were highly segregated, over 90% underrepresented minorities, we were not able to make a dent in the learning, but we were able to show effects on standardized the state tests for diagram items, and there were slight differences across which type of diagram item there was. If you really want to know all the details, you should read the paper that Ting is on from Science Education. But we were able to get some transfer, which was very exciting to us. All right, more high school diagram interventions. Some of you guys read papers that talked about the student completed visual and verbal and self-explanation. The only thing I want to point out about self-explanation is that the kids hated it, but they didn't learn any worse from it. The teachers, I think, were kind of annoyed. And we've also done this as a warm-up. In other words, kids come in, instead of doing the, I don't know, astronomy crossword puzzle that's completely unrelated to what they're learning, we just gave them questions that they spent the same 5 minutes on. Some of them, this was nice because it was a within classroom assignment of individuals to condition, so sitting right next to somebody else who might be in the control condition. They either got the conventions of diagrams and a question that asked them to look at the diagram, or an unrelated question that was provided by the textbook publisher. So basically we did 9 studies. One of them was in chemistry, one of them was in high school chemistry. And we find basically significant effects on near transfer, meaning if we're teaching in biology, we see some effects on biology, but not the instructed diagrams, and some of those effect sizes are large. We see some far transfer effects with geology, again, depending on the study. We see significant effects on biology knowledge gain, but we also see these problematical interactions with some individual differences in the kids. And just to go back for a second here, when the students were given partial diagrams and asked to draw in missing parts of the diagrams, they loved it, they had so much fun with the colored pencils. But it really helped the high spatial kids, and it actually hurt the low spatial kids. Hurt them in the sense that they scored below the conventions of diagrams kids, which was our active comparison condition. So to us that's very worrisome, because if we can avoid doing this one that disadvantages anybody, the other options like conventions of diagrams, coordinating text and diagrams, self-explanation, and verbal completion appear to be neutral with regard to that individual difference. Yeah?
The verbal completion is just filling in the labels that are missing from the diagrams, is that correct?
It's not just labels, because sometimes we would take out part of a sentence in a caption. Yeah, so we tried to be deliberate about what we took out, and we also could not use the kids' own textbooks, because otherwise they just would have opened to that page in their textbook and said, oh, look, I can just copy. Mm-hmm. So we had to do a very interesting thing. We had to sort of go out to the web, find public domain images that were analogous. So if you think about something like a, Gregor Mendel, parental generation, first filial generation, second filial generation, we found these analogous diagrams that laid out the same scenario, but with a different plant or a different organism.
And the differential outcomes on individual differences then for the low spatial only applied when they were completing the drawing, not when they were completing the verbal?
That's correct. Yeah, we never went in and collected anything like their prior reading comprehension. Yeah. So it's possible it could have interacted in that way, but it's what would we say? It's an unmeasured moderator. Okay, so we do have some eye tracking data on these kids, and the changes were very small and never seemed worth publishing. Just kind of sad. So moving on, this was yet another study, but moving into math. One of the things that struck me as I was looking at one of these calculus textbooks in the university student bookstore is that when you're in most calculus textbooks, you see a fair amount of tables and graphs and algebraic expressions, but not a deliberate attention to here's a table, here's a graph, put them together. Here's a table, here's an algebraic expression, put them together. Here's an algebraic expression, here's a graph, put them together. Whereas there's one particular strand of reform calculus, this is funded by NSF, where they deliberately and explicitly emphasize these coordinations. But we don't really know much about, those students who are coming into college. What can they do with these pairs of representations? So in the first year we did some eye tracking and some paper and pencil measures. We gathered some spatial skills data, and we had 3 groups: a pre-calculus high school, a calculus high school, and some undergraduate engineering students. The undergraduate engineering students disappointed us, so they did worse than the calculus students, because they were kind of rusty on their calculus, I think. In year 2, we were able to look for a very small sample at change over the course of a school year. But in year 3, we did what I think is really cool. We just put some arrows on some stuff. So we said, notice, that the slope is decreasing. Notice that this coefficient is negative. Unfortunately, our samples were a little bit small, but we were able to show at a p less than 0.10 level that those modifications, those very simple modifications, were able to change the patterns with which students were looking. We also had a lot of fun figuring out how can we take these Excel spreadsheets with 30,000 data points from one eye tracking session and in an automated way pull out and detect your eyes went from the top left to the bottom right in a straight line, which we were able to do, which is pretty cool. We call it the robot. We also did some analyses of what was going on in the textbooks, and I think this helped us to understand that in the literature, people talk about multiple representations. And they talk about this idea of coordinating multiple representations as if it were one thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really, really, really clear that it's not one thing. Even within this kind of pre-calculus and calculus skill of tables and graphs and algebraic expressions, that each pair of those is really a different thing. So we have a nice piece in Learning and Instruction that lays out kind of 2 different ways that students approached these tasks. One was more of a plug and chug, and one was more of reflected a better conceptual understanding of functions, in the sense that, oh yes, if there's an x squared term in here, or if there's a curve in the graph, if there's a quadratic in the graph, a sort of a more conceptual understanding. We also used an interesting error detection paradigm here, in that half of the pairs of representations did represent the same function, and half of the pairs were a mismatch. And so their task was to detect the mismatch, and I think that worked really well as an experimental paradigm. Moving on. We also wondered about sketching above and beyond looking at diagrams, but if you make your own, does that help you? And we worked with Ken Forbes, who developed this CogSketch artificial intelligence-based sketching program. And he came up with this idea of a kind of a template that you could, for example, put a partial diagram up on the screen, and then the students could sketch over top of it or identify on top of that provided image some piece. So we did blood flow. For those of you who know Roger Azevedo, of course, I'm channeling Roger here when I'm using the circulatory system. And so the kids would complete a task, or they'd get partway through a task, and then they could request feedback. So there was this adaptive feedback that was provided over the class period. And so we were looking at how the kids were using the feedback when they were doing this sketching to learn. And what was interesting is that it looks like there are 3 separate subgroups of kids here. The kids who started out pretty high in prior knowledge. They're not at ceiling, but they didn't learn anything because they would draw, and then they would ask for the feedback too late. So we called them these infrequent clickers. Then we have this kind of like, draw a little help, draw a little help, draw a little help. And then we have these students who, they do ask for a lot of feedback, but it's kind of like they draw, and then they get some help. And then they draw, and then get some help. And draw, then get some help. And really the take-home from this is that if they take more advantage of the feedback in the learning environment, they learn more from it. And so I think this is an interesting take-home in terms of students constructing their own representations and sort of moving towards this idea of adaptive learning systems that maybe could be giving some slightly more individualized help to students as they're learning. We also did some work also with middle school students, but thinking about sketching, but not on a computer and not with feedback, but going back to some more basic research. And we were interested in self-explanation and sketching because people have hypothesized for both of them that they work because they force you to draw more inferences, and that they work because they force you to be more metacognitive, to engage in more metacognitive monitoring. So we had self-explanation only, sketching only, self-explanation and then sketching, sketching and then self-explanation, and a read-only control group. And Ting Dai worked on this project as a postdoc at Urbana-Champaign in 2014, 2015. We also got, we did this in math and science, so we wrote 4 math problems which we tried to make more or less spatialized, and 4 science problems likewise. And we got some prior knowledge measures and some spatial abilities. So you might be starting to get this theme of like, I am interested in individual differences and how they interact with these various approaches to learning. We got we coded their sketches very extensively, and I had really wonderful master's student who is now a middle school science teacher, and also Think Aloud. And it turns out that if you ask them to sketch, either alone or in combination, they do better on their answers than not sketching, which we thought was pretty cool. And the other really interesting thing is that what they're putting in the sketches is related to the accuracy of their answers. So they're engaged in the work, and then they stop and we say, give us your answer. We code those for accuracy. But the Think Aloud verbalizations, what they're saying about what they're sketching, or what they're saying in their self-explanations, was not related to the quality of the answers. So if you're a teacher, I think you want to trust what kids are putting on the page, but don't trust what they're saying about it. And this reminds me a bit of some of the work in gesture, where this is like an old Martha Alibali paper, right? But people will be gesturing correctly, but speaking incorrectly about what they're doing. So they'll say, the gears are going in the same direction, but they're gesturing the gears going in opposite directions. And I think that this has some real implications for teachers, that really you ought to look over the kid's shoulder and look at the work, but not necessarily trust what they're saying to you, because they may not be able to articulate their full level of understanding. How much should I keep going? I'll keep going here. This is some secondary analysis of some data that we had collected quite a while ago, but kids were given short illustrated text, and they were given 3 questions. One question that you could only answer from the text, one question, or that you could answer only from the text, one question that you could answer only from the diagram, and one that required you to look at both. What's interesting is they really did do better when they were in the text and diagram questions in terms of the accuracy. And they also used more different moves and a larger variety of moves, and they made more inferences. But interestingly, when they were in the diagrams, they were activating some inaccurate prior knowledge and then doing these fairly sophisticated but wrong knowledge elaborations. This was especially true with one that was an Archaeopteryx, so it's an ancestor of birds, but they were sort of bringing in some inaccurate and irrelevant bird knowledge. And unlike the undergraduate students, with the undergraduate students in their biology texts, we found that, you know, they could be making an accurate inference or an inaccurate inference, but the more they did inferences, the better they understood that biology text. But here, it was the more accurate move, so accurately summarizing, accurately paraphrasing, that was related to the quality of their answers. So to me, that's sort of a lingering question. We got inspired when we were doing some work, intervention work with undergraduate biology students, and Ting Dai is co-principal investigator on this IES-funded Goal 2 project. We said, well, we want to do some cognitive strategy instruction, and we could do some compare and contrast in diagrams. So if you think way back to the 2010 paper, where we were noticing that the students were comparing and contrasting, we said, well, let's teach them how to do this. And we were able to cleverly build, I think, 4 of these strategy instruction videos that happened just before their first exam and not have any of them afterwards. So we could really see the effect of this compare and contrast strategy. We wrote scripts. We're using the Presley and Harris strategy instruction model. And then we had actors and actresses who would verbalize these scripts. And they were following week by week the course content, but not using the student's own textbook. It was going to another textbook covering the same content. And they do score significantly higher on their first course exam compared to those who were in experimental conditions where they didn't get this compare and contrast in diagrams. So I think it's another nice proof of concept about, yes, we can teach, we know what people do when they are making sense out of diagrams, and we can teach them to do it, and we can teach it at the middle school level, we can teach it at the high school level, we can teach it at the undergrad level. This is really hot off the press, because this is what I'm just working on right now. We collected a lot of think-alouds, I think 86, on biology text for the purpose of creating some items for a parallel form on a measurement grant that Dr. Dai is co-PI on. And, but we also wanted to make some use of the think-alouds. And we looked at what the students were recalling after they read, and we looked at to what extent do they have causal chains in those recalls. And then we looked into, first of all, were those causal statements just memorized from the text? You know, the text gave you the causal chain and you just were remembering what you were given. Or was it more an inference that were, inferences that were drawn by the students, kind of integrating more across what they had read? And then we're thinking about what's happening during reading. So again, there's kind of the what happens at the end and then what's happening during learning. Trying to think about to what extent during reading are they making inferences, and to what extent during reading are they taking up that causal language or not taking it up. Because we were talking about this over lunch, one of the things that I noticed is that a fair number of them, as they're reading, they won't say the CD14, the bacterial fragment binds to the CD14 protein, or CD14 receptor, which signals the toll-like receptor, which then begins the protein kinase cascade. They say bacterial fragment CD14 toll-like receptor. And the action verbs are completely stripped from what they're saying. And you could be teaching that student or meeting with them in office hours and think, oh, they have the temporal sequence right, therefore they understand the causal relations. We have a hypothesis that they don't understand the causal relations at all, that they're simply treating it as a temporal sequence. So we're going to try to see, and we don't know the answers to these questions, whether what's happening during reading to what extent that is then reflected in the post-reading recall for the causal language and for the inferences. And then before I'll close up with what we've learned and what I think the lingering questions are. But I have an ECR synthesis grant to do a meta-analysis of multimedia learning, looking at text and diagrams, animation, hyperlinking like Dr. Lawless's work, simulations. And if you think across those theories, I think those theories are increasingly not able to account for the findings. We have findings that are just kind of running away from the theories. And I think the focus of most of those theories is, could we design these stimuli better? Could I make the perfect animation? Could I make the perfect diagram? If I just made my diagram better, people would learn. But I also think when you read this literature, especially if you read it with things like the reading framework that came out of the National Reading Panel, you start to think about, well, there's the text, there's the stimulus, and you can change the text, but there's also the reader and what the reader brings to it. And then there's also what was the task that you asked them to do. And if you're not thinking about the text and the reader and the task, your theory of multimedia, if you're only thinking about the stimulus, right, you can really be giving bad advice to people who are learning how to be designers. So in this meta-analysis, I'm thinking about the way that tasks are varied and the way that content itself is modified or simplified, as well as these individual differences. They should start sounding familiar, like knowledge, spatial skills, working memory, and those then interact with stimulus design, choice of task, and simplification or non-simplification of content. And if you know, for example, cognitive load theory, this does show up in one little corner of cognitive load theory, which says higher knowledge people may be harmed by our stimulus modifications, right? But if you think about generalizing that beyond just the stimulus and beyond knowledge to spatial skills, working memory, motivation, and also interactions with tasks and interactions with these content choices, all of a sudden cognitive load theory doesn't explain very well what's going on. So we've now coded 800 effect sizes across a few hundred papers. And we're coding also for dependent variables that are factual, inferential, procedural, or transfer, with the thought that there may be different patterns across different kinds of learning outcomes. So now, the moment you've all been waiting for. What have we learned? First of all, I think it's become really evident that the repertoires of strategies and inferences that people use when they're in the running text and when they're in the other representations are quite different from each other. And that the non-text representations are really good for getting people to make inferences. But over and over and over again in literature, you're starting to see that the students avoid those diagrams. And we even have it in our 86 Think Alouds. I noticed you didn't look at the diagram. We did a little post Think Aloud debrief. I noticed you didn't look at that. Oh, they're so hard. Just didn't feel like it. So and not only do students avoid them, but instructors really discount the difficulty of these tasks. They're kind of like, yeah, it's picture. Yeah, I know how to do it. And you see this in textbooks too. End of chapter exercise asks you to make some inference from a graph. But there's nothing in the chapter that told you how to read the graph. We're going to test you on it, but we're not going to teach you how to do it. So teachers are like, yeah, oh yeah, this is just obvious. I'm being nice to you by letting you come into my classroom and do your research here, but it's just, it's understanding these things is obvious. Well, reading probably was invented about 3000 BCE, cuneiform. We teach reading. Arabic numeral system, debates in the literature, but somewhere from 200 to 800 AD, we teach math. These canonical representations are from the Enlightenment. They're from the 1780s. We got to teach them. We got to teach kids how to make sense out of them. And I think in some disciplines it's more sort of evident, like in chemistry, you sort of know, like, well, we got to teach them ball and stick, and we got to teach them wedge and dash, right? Whereas in other disciplines, like, oh, no, you just look at it and you know what it means. I think we've also learned that this task of coordinating, or these tasks of coordinating multiple recitations can be taught in a lot of different ways, and we keep getting these effect sizes of like about 0.5. It's like, oh, what's the effect? 0.5. What's the effect? 0.5. What's the effect? 0.5. In other words, there's no obvious way to go about teaching this stuff that works better than other ways. But some of them are disliked by students, like spell of exclamation, and some of them disadvantage low spatial, which some of the drawing essentially seems to disadvantage the low spatial. And then tentatively, this idea that in diagrams, maybe in diagrams more than in other kinds of representations, the students can pick up on this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, but without including the causal verbs. So, lingering questions. We have this issue of what happens during learning, and then we have what's your outcome score like after learning. And I think we don't have a really good grasp across this body of literature, which might be 500 studies by now, about when learning with when accuracy during learning matters and when it doesn't matter. I also think a lot about transfer, not just transfer to an uninstructed domain, but maybe at a longer time period, because usually we're doing immediate post-tests, and I wonder how does any of this last 5 weeks later, end of the semester, next semester, which are big questions for learning generally. I really wonder about adaptive scaffolding and these questions about how to scaffold, when to give feedback, and how could we tailor that to these individual differences, because I think it really begs the question of if high spatial responds this way and low spatial responds this way, if high knowledge responds this way and low knowledge responds this way, shouldn't we try to make some adaptive systems, and this would probably really require computer-based interventions. How can we sensitize teachers to these issues, that students have difficulties, how to teach the skills, and maybe recognizing the risks of teaching these skills in certain ways, given that nobody's going around testing the spatial skills of their students, right? And then how can we convince learners to engage with these non-text representations that are on the one hand more difficult, but on the other hand, the payoff is big. So for those of you who are writing the big term paper, aka the dissertation, these would be great questions. And then I thought I should close maybe with the like super high-tech end of things, which is, so the real cutting edge in multimedia research, I think, is around novel visualization. So Mike Stife has some work on some novel chemical visualizations. I'm working with a team at UIUC on these, it's a finite element analysis is the name. It's not a software, it's sort of like the way SEM software encompasses lots of different software brands, but finite element analysis is able to do these fine-grained models of things like stresses and strains, and what do people look at when they look at these? How do they make sense out of them? Why is this area red? Should my eye be drawn to it because it's red? Is it relevant to whatever kind of task I'm going to be required to do with this visualization? And then another kind of cutting edge is, this is a radiology example, but the expert radiologist is eye-tracked while they're looking at this, it must be a MRI slice, and you take the novice and you make them follow the expert's eye scan path, and it's actually had some pretty good results with helping people become better at those kinds of tasks. So this is the obligatory, the research report here was supported by a lot of NSF and a lot of IES money, and the opinions are ours and not the views of the government. But also a really long list of people who've worked on this large set of projects, and I think that is part of the pleasure of this work, is working with lots of smart and energetic people. So thank you very much for your